Hello and welcome to the September 2023 ENSO seminar. This is our first seminar of the 2023-2024 academic term, and I am delighted to be joined today by Thomas van Es from San Sebastian, from the University of the Basque Country there. Thomas completed his PhD in the University of Antwerp, is doing postdoctoral research in San Sebastian, and has published a number of papers across a range of different topics relevant to enactive thinking, looking at aspects of. I first came across Thomas's work when it was the idea of autism as sensory motor difference, which was published as part of the special issue, a collection of inactive ethics papers in Topoi. Thomas has a number of papers on the relationship between enactive thinking and the free energy principle and the predictive processing model and so on. But today we will be looking, or we'll be hearing from Thomas about more recent work, some ongoing work, and we'll be engaging in some of the philosophical pitfalls and potential issues that the enactive approach is. I guess criticisms that are often leveled and questions as to whether they are accurate and telling, or whether they are misguided and perhaps mistargeted. So very welcome, Thomas. Thanks a million for your time and for sharing your work today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. So we will begin, as I say, as we sometimes do, with sort of kick things off by immediately digressing and looking at taking a quick commercial break, which is just to flag something that you have read recently or come across recently that you think deserves a little bit of a boost or a little bit of advertising. You've a sort of particularly interesting example of that, I think, from this.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's a really fun way to start it off. And so next to this, I've also been working on enactivism and dialectics and trying to develop that relation. And so I got this really nice book. I don't know how well it's. Yeah. And so it's a textbook from Vietnam for university students. It really is just an introduction into dialectical materialism and materialist dialectics, because honestly, all that dialectics was very, very new to me. And it's hard to find this very easy, straightforward introduction. And this is as straightforward as it gets. It's newly translated into English just this year. And it's very nice because it's filled with these annotations covering all these things that Vietnamese students are kind of supposed to know, because they get dialectics there since starting primary school. So it's just like the difference between a sort of classic way in which we understand how someone fries an egg and then eats it, and a more dialectical understanding of it. So much more basic, you really can't find it. And the title, I've been putting off saying it because it's incredibly long. It's the Curriculum of the Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism, Part 1, the Worldview and Philosophical Methodology of Marxism-Leninism. And it's this is Part 1, this is dialectical materialism, and then other parts we do historical materialism, and the rest I don't really remember. The publisher is Banyan House. It's sort of an independent thing, and they have a free PDF too, so it's kind of open access. That's really nice as well. Yeah, so that's my little commercial break to start it off with.
Excellent. Yeah, no, and nice to see. I mean, the dialectics has just been one of those things that's seeing increasing reference in the enactive literature probably since about the mid-teens or so. So it's and not an area I know much about at all. So actually very useful to have that kind of reference. So excellent. Thank you very much for that. So I see we have a few viewers on with us live, and as ever we'll no doubt catch more speakers as things go on. But in the meantime, I guess we might kick off with the talk. So I invite you, Thomas, to begin the September 2023 ENSO seminar.
Yes. Okay, so I'm sharing the screen, I think. Right, it's working.
Yep.
And it's moving. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so the title of my talk is Beyond the Realism-Idealism Trap with Enactive Perception. And just to situate it, it really is about the realism-idealism debate for perception specifically. So it's kind of about the mind-world relation for enactivism and the different varieties of realism and idealism that you can find here. And it's kind of interesting to see where enactivism fits here, because looking at the literature, it just seems to be everywhere. Harry Heft, ecological psychologist, argued just 3 years ago that it really feels like enactivism is idealist, and he comes at it from a critical perspective, thinking it's wrong. Then Karim Zahidi, former colleague here in Antwerp, and he essentially argues for realism through material manipulation. And it targets non-representationalist cognitive science, but he grapples with enough of the enactive literature for it to be relevant here. And then much more recently, just 2 years ago, Jola and Figueiredo argue, following the embodied mind, for a sort of middle passage. And I'm here going to argue that none of the above are adequate, because the question itself is problematic. So first, I'll just get into the enactive basics and sensory motor autonomy. Then I'll grapple a little bit with the realism or idealism question and argue that we shouldn't even get into a middle passage. And what I hope to mostly do today is get into the positive story, which is about process and organization, and is what I think should be the path forward. But this is very kind of, as Merrick already said, work in progress. It's a bit speculative. So any and all questions are very much welcome. I do have a bonus slide on the ethical dimension of this realism-idealism debate. And it'll be nice if I can get into that, but it sort of depends on how I'm doing on time. So starting, what is enactivism? I take enactivism to be kind of an approach to cognitive science that stresses embodiment, right? So we're talking about the social material bodies, and the processes that make up these bodies are fundamentally understood in terms of their relations with one another, and specifically the autonomous organizations that they get into. Now, any process is, of course, going to have duration and development over time. And so crucial to understanding these sorts of things is the historicity, the historical development of the system, and of course, fundamentally, its interaction as a body with the environment. And because of that interaction being so fundamental, the world is already part of our story. And so there is no need to have mental representations of this world, because it's right there. We don't need to picture it in our head still. And so you can kind of contrast this with the more traditional view, which is very neurocentric. You have this independent agent of a brain, which is kind of atomized. It receives inputs and sends out outputs. And at any one time slice, it will need to send out one of those outputs, which is really an action plan, right? And since the input coming in at any one time slice is going to be incredibly impoverished, it will need to get into all of these complex computations and develop rich mental representations to be able to develop a decent action plan. And I think what's interesting about this is that what you see is that this kind of philosophical commitments at the start determine certain empirical facts that we take to be present in the world. And depending on where you start, you get a very different result. Now, if we're looking specifically at autonomy for enactivism, we usually distinguish 3 different forms. We have autopoiesis, which is really about biological self-production. Then we have sensory motor autonomy, which is about the action perception dynamics and the autonomous organizations of our activities. And then we have social autonomy, which is more about group dynamics. So we can talk about social cultural groups as a very broad thing that may be autonomously organized. But then there's also dialogues and the specific autonomous organization of the different things going on in a dialogue. And so if we're looking at autonomy in enactivism, we're looking at an operational definition in terms of how to find it. So it's really a matter of what sort of things do you need to do to determine whether a system is autonomous or not. And there's three central concepts here. It's operational closure, precariousness, and self-individuation. And operational closure is this very particular way that processes can organize. And so when you're looking at a system, you're going to be jotting down the particular processes of that system. And you're going to have a look at how they relate to one another. Does the continuation of one process enable the continuation of another process? Is it materially necessary for the continuation of that other process? And then if you find that some of these processes end up recursively enabling themselves as a network, you have a self-enabling network. And that's what we find here in this nice little diagram where 1, 2, and 3 all kind of enable one another. So they are enabled by one another and also enable one another. And they form a self-enabling network, but E only interacts with the network through enabling 3, but it's not enabled by, and so it's outside of the network. Precariousness then really just means that these nodes would cease unless they are actively enabled, which then also means that the network would cease unless it is actively enabled. And if that's the case for the particular system you're looking at, then it is a precarious system. Once you have these two things in place, you find that it sort of self-individuates. And this means that it produces, or at least establishes, its own boundary. There is a sense in which the 1, 2, and 3 processes are internal to the system, and E is external to the system. And once you have an operationally closed precarious system, you have an autonomous system. And autonomy comes from Greek, meaning sort of self-law. And what we mean by that is that given the particular system that it is, it determines a sort of law, a good and bad for potential interactions. And that's a very basic, minimal sort of sense, because it's just about how potential interactions that the system can engage in can enable or inhibit the continuation of a system. It's just a plain fact, given the way that the system is, that some things can do good and do bad for its continuation. And this is sometimes referred to as the inherent normativity of the system, and this graded notion of autonomy then comes from the notion of adaptivity. So when we're looking at sensory motor autonomy specifically, we're really talking about the autonomous organization of sensory motor activity. And here I'm mostly relying on the work of my now colleague in Spain, Xavier Barandiaran. And so what this is about self-enabling bundles or clusters of activities. And sometimes that's called habits as well, but it's not really something I'm working on myself. The idea is that this is the basis for cognition, or at the very least sensory motor cognition. It's also sometimes called mental life. And this is supposed to be dependent on, but ultimately irreducible to, autopoiesis or biological life. And so since we're talking about sensory motor autonomy, it's sensory motor activity that is key here, which is already about the relation between the organism and the environment. And so any sensory motor mind, insofar you can speak of a mind as a thing, is really just a bundle of these relations as they pertain over time. And so perception in enactive terms, I think, should really be seen in terms of potential sensory motor activity, the encounter of all the potentialities of what you can do in an environment, and not first and foremost in terms of object or category recognition. And so now that we have kind of the enactive basis ready, we can look into realism or idealism and see that I'm going to argue at least we do not even need a middle passage. So I'll first talk about some general issues with, I think, the question. I can't really get into all of the realist and idealist positions because there's just no time. And then I'm going to be looking at the middle passage solution. So one way I think you can kind of grasp the realism or idealism debate is by asking the question, is what we perceive imposed on us by the world, or is it internally constructed? And the former imposed on us by the world is then the realist solution, where the world determines your percept, and the internal construction is the idealist solution, where it's really just about your internal workings that are primary here. And a potential enactive solution could be some sort of sensory motor interactionism, because we're talking about the sensory motor relations. It's a bit of world, it's a bit of us, it's a happy get together middle passage. And my idea is that there would be a different answer, and I'm really talking about a different question, or the question is wrong here. And I think it's not really in the potential answers to the question, but it's about the assumption, the what we perceive part of that question, the whatness. Because really what I think this does is it assumes perception as this process of producing these things that we have that are about something else, that have certain features or characteristics, and then those features or characteristics can be either imposed on us or internally constructed. So the explanandum here in this question is this what it is likeness, the sense datum or the qual. And the issue with this is that in enactive perception, we are looking at perception in terms of potential interaction. It's not really about objects or this raw sensory feel. There are no qualia over and above the interaction. I think that's very nicely argued by O'Regan and Noe in their 2001 paper. So this what we perceive idea really feels like it reifies the sensory motor interaction into a product that is detached from that interaction. So the processes in enactivism are the perceptual relation. Their product, really, if anything, is their continuation and development, not some sort of mental surplus, an addition, or a mediation. And I think what's going on here is that in this what we perceive view, we're really looking at perception in the abstract. We're looking at perception as the general phenomenon of vision, of audition, or things like that. Whereas what we should be doing in enactivism, I think, is look at perception as a concrete phenomenon. And then it's more about how I navigate my environment when I'm cycling to work, this concrete thing that happens almost every day. And the thing is that when you look at perception as a concrete phenomenon, this instantly already invites explanation in terms of the processes that unfold, their historical development, and their interrelation. So if we're going to ask that question, we're going to be talking about my familiarity with the path. Oh, I cycle this every day. I know where to go. My familiarity with my bicycle, with cycling in general, and whether it was busy on the road or not. These kinds of things, which are my history and my interrelations with my environment. And so we may start in the abstract with our philosophical inquiries, asking, what is perception? But then we need to work our way down to concrete reality if we want to actually understand it. And so the issue with asking this question in general is that it assumes perception as producing things, it reifies the sensory motor interaction, and in the end, it ends up looking at perception in the abstract instead of as a concrete phenomenon. So, nonetheless, it seems like the enactive mainstream is really that we're following a middle passage. And this has most recently been argued for by Colla and Figueiredo in 2021 with their excellent paper, Bringing Forth the World Literally. And they kind of talk about it in terms of three different ways that we're bringing forth a world. It's enaction, niche construction, and social niches. Now, enaction is this meaning creation through action. And just very minimally, it's that distinction between potential interactions that can enable or inhibit the continuation of the system, that inherent normativity I talked about, and the adaptivity of it. And so what they say is this against realism because it's very organism-centric, right? It's about what an organism does that creates this meaning. It's about individual differentiation. And it's against idealism because it centers action as a fundamental core component. It's fundamentally world-involving. And so niche construction is this term that comes from the evolution sciences, which is about the way animals, a lot of living systems alter the world so as to change their environmental demands for themselves, for their community, but also for their lineage and their cohabitants. And like typical examples are beavers building a dam or rabbits building a burrow, but of course also just all of our architecture, buildings, roads, and all of that. And this way of bringing forth the world is very anti-idealist because it really is just about these material interactions that we have in the world. And then social niches is maybe specific to humans, at least we have it. And it's the development of culture, convention, and all of those kinds of things. And what Colla and Figueiredo argue is that it is not first in the mind, really first in our material interaction with the environment, following along with material engagement theory of Malafouris. So the idea is that this social development of these ideas is nonetheless still rooted in material engagement. So these mental faculties are still to be understood in terms of their material historical development process. So kind of summing up this position, they say it's anti-realist because it's, organism-centric and there's this individual differentiation. But it's also anti-idealist because it's fundamentally world-involving at every stage of bringing forth a world. So what they say is that their view offers a genuine middle way between realism and idealism. Enactivism is a viable alternative because it eschews the common denominator of both views. And I think that's very strange because on one hand, they say it's a genuine middle way because it eschews the common denominator, but really that sounds much more like a viable alternative. And so there's this very, very, very silly analogy that I've been using to explain this. So there's two bakeries and one of them sells sweet bread and the other sells savory bread. But you don't want bread. You don't want them because of what they share, what they have in common. You want rice. Is going for rice then a middle passage between the two bakeries, or is it a viable alternative? And I think it's really just a viable alternative. And I think it makes a lot of sense in enactivism for this to be a viable alternative instead of a middle passage, because in many ways in enactivism, we are continuously busy kind of rethinking the foundations of our philosophical frameworks. And yet realism-idealism is rooted in all these old foundations of reification and representationalism. And so it makes a lot of sense, I think, that we really just need to, once again, lay our own path in walking. And so the next step is trying to take that walk. So catching up a little, what do we have for enactivism? We have that enactive perception is relational. We have that enactive perception is interactive. And because the world is already part of the interaction, ontological realism is safe. We do not need to doubt whether there's a world, we're acting in it. And we have that there's no phenomenal experience over and above the interaction. And so if you remember when I was talking about operational closure, It was about these processes and how they relate to one another. So what's fundamental in enactivism is this process, this movement over time, and the relations to other processes, and not objects or static properties. Those aren't really fundamental. So we can see enactivism in light of a process ontology, and Sean Gallagher has worked on this, published on it in 2021. And so on top of that, we also have the operational definition of autonomy, which means there is an interaction dependence for the judgments. And so any judgment on whether a system is or isn't autonomous is going to be a historical, socially materially situated encounter of organism and environment. And so what I think is, if we're looking at what this brings us, is a Kantian collapse, or maybe better to say a collapse of the Kantian distinction between phenomena and things in themselves. And we're really just talking about processes and their organization. And I'm going to try and walk you through my train of thought here. So movement and change are fundamental, right? We talked about process ontology, and processes necessarily influence one another, because that's just what processes do. Like if I move what is around me, and very minimally already through the surroundings resistance, that movement feeds back into my own movement. So once you have movement, you instantly have mutual impact between surroundings and the process that is moving. Now, once you have influence, this means there is also the possibility of an enabling or inhibiting influence. Right? It's not necessary, but it's totally possible that if I move, some other process starts moving, and my movement may be materially necessary for the continuation of that other process. And now with that, it's also totally possible that this chain of movements, or a network of these sorts of movements enabling one another, start forming a self-enabling network. They start recursively enabling themselves. And at that point, you have operational closure. Now, it's also possible that if that enabling were to stop, then the system stops. And with that, essentially, you have precariousness. And once you have operational closure and precariousness, you have an autonomous system. And so, quickly summing up what I've been doing here, we have movement, and because of that, we have influence. And because we have influence, we can talk about potential enabling relations, and that opens the possibility for there to be self-enabling networks, operational closure. That sort of network can be precarious, and if it is, then it is autonomous. And the thing is that this is all natural, right? There's no additives, no added sugars or masked additional assumptions that are snuck in, or if there are, please do let me know and I missed it. So moving on, because we have movement, we have the potential for autonomy. And autonomy means we have this inside-outside distinction given the specific materiality of the network, right? So that's what I talked about with the diagram. You have 1, 2, and 3 is the internal, the inside, and E is the outside. So this means you have some very basic sense of a perspective. You have a sort of positionality from which the outside is encountered. And since it is an autonomous system, this is also value-laden, meaning there is a distinction between potentially helpful or not helpful interactions given the continuation of the system as a norm. So that's that inherent normativity or adaptivity. And once again, there's no additives here. It's really just we're talking process and enactive autonomy. And that's kind of important because there's nothing like a mental substance or these unique mental properties that could indicate some sort of rift between world and organism. World is processes and complex organizations, and organism is processes and complex organizations. And so there's no reason, I think, to get into this distinction of phenomena and things in themselves. And so if we're saying, well, everything is process and complex organization, how do we talk about differences? Because I'm a different person from the next person, and a person is different from a laptop. And I think we kind of covered this already, because processes impact change in some surroundings differently than they do in others because of the materiality of these surroundings, which co-determines this impact and feeds it back. As I said, impact is always mutual. And so even in one environment, if we were to swap one autonomous system for another, this instantly entails a change in this mutual impact between organism and environment. So there really cannot even be the same surroundings for two different autonomous systems in a material sense in terms of the impact that it has on the processes around it. So just by existing, an autonomous system already entails individual differentiation between different autonomous systems. And one thing that's maybe a little tricky, because I've been talking about, well, it's just process and organization, and that kind of sounds like a very reductive view of all the complexities of life. I don't think it needs to, because we have this complex organization, and this really gives us a multidimensional view of autonomy. And there's still value in looking at the autonomous level of organization, the supraorganismic level of social organization, but also, of course, in looking at the component processes making up an autonomous organization. And it really just depends on what we're interested in researching at the moment, which we pick out. There's not one privileged level in this network, I think. So summing up, I think what we got here is that if we start with a process-first ontology and we analyze these things in terms of enactive autonomy, we can say yes to ontological realism. We can say no to realism-idealism debate in perception, because, reification and this very kind of wrong-headed view of perception. We can say yes to perspectives and individual differentiation, and we can say yes to normativity, or at the very least, a very basic sense of value-ladenness that I've discussed. So my conclusion, coming at the end, is that the realism-idealism question should be rejected, and we should not be dealing in middle passages. Although, as I discussed, what has been proposed as a middle passage, I think, honestly, is very much on the right track. It's just the positioning in the debate that I think is a mistake being made. And if we look at things in terms of a process ontology, we can reject the phenomena in itself distinction that I think has been plaguing philosophy of mind for a very, very long time. I'm kind of trying to look at Marek here. Do I have time for my quick ethics bonus? He gives the thumbs up. That's good. So I know I've been rushing through a lot of different topics already, and it's not stopping here. There's a lot on this slide, and I'm just gonna run through it. And if anyone has any ideas or complaints or comments or questions about this, I would be very happy to hear that. So I think there's two basic facts spurring on the realism-idealism debate. On one hand, we have a shared world of walkable stairs, of laptops to write with, and all these different things in our environment that we all recognize are there. And on the other hand, we have this radical individual differentiation in the interaction potentials. Right? There are wheelchair people who cannot walk on stairs. There are poor people who do not have access to consumer electronics, and even just people who have never come in contact with a laptop and would have no idea what to do with it other than opening it and inspecting it. And so there's a tension here. And I think the realist emphasizes the first part, the shared world. And in some sense, what they say, if you say that perception is, viewing the objective world, is there's really just there's one perception of one universal world. And in some sense, what that means is if you don't perceive that same objective world, that's a personal failing. That's on you. And so if not adhering to the norm means it's your own fault, then it really doesn't make sense to advocate for, say, better accessibility of public transport for wheelchair people, or erasing poverty, or any of these things that a lot of us probably think are important. And idealism kind of takes the other side, right? It hyper focuses on this individual differentiation, and it really kind of sums up into each their own. And yet society, of course, cannot bend to everyone's individual needs, because just plainly some of them are contradictory. And I think what really kind of grounds both of them, what they both result in, is a form of individualism, where if you have an issue, it's up to you to make the best of it. And given that we all live in societies with millions of people, that's not really a way that we're going to move forward in all these very problematic things that we have in our environment. And so enactivism, I think, kind of allows for this by having this multi-dimensional view. And it's nice because it really allows you to analyze how these individual grievances connect with societal structures, and which processes or process networks enable this and are enabled by this. And by analyzing these tensions between individual and social organization, I think that enactivism allows us a way to move forward and bring about the positive change that I think we all know that we really need. And so that's my bonus slide. That's my full presentation. I'm very happy to have been able to do this. Very thankful for your attention, and I hope to get some questions.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Thomas. So I'll keep an eye on the chat online. I'll, as is my wont, feed in some comments and queries from there. I guess so. There's sort of lots of ways in which I'd like to come at this, actually. And I guess one of the first things is just to pick up on, and just if you that slide there that you have with the summary is implicit in the way you've approached the issue is this idea of wanting to maintain a yes to ontological realism. So the specific realism-idealism debate that you're digging into here is, as you said, very specifically about the relation between mind and world, or mental life and world, cognition and world, whatever, however we want to parse that. So I guess just to confirm that you see that ontological realism as a virtue, as something that needs to be maintained, and that the enactive, or people working within an enactive approach, should seek to maintain.
Yeah, I think so, because once we start doubting that, I think now it's really nice that I got to the ethical dimension. That starts to just become so difficult. If we can't just agree, y'all, we're in a world and we're sharing it, then actually doing the things that make the world better, it becomes difficult to really get that off the ground. And so I think we have good reason for it, because we're talking about interactions, and if we don't know if there's a world that we're interacting with, then what's the very basis of our enactive work, right? In interaction. So there's this kind of dual answer, I guess. On one hand, I think we just have good reason, and it's, I think, important for our foundations. But there's also this ethical part where our analysis kind of becomes moot if we're not doing anything to make a positive difference. And if we're doubting whether the world is there, then the positive difference doesn't even make a difference, because, I don't know, we don't even know if it's there, so we might not need to improve it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's just, that's a sort of interesting perspective. I think it is something that that comes up in aspects of enactive thinking, but it means that, or it highlights that we encounter ontological questions within already existing activities that are shared and social and therefore ethically engaged. So it, very much anti-reductive, as you identified, that the science is something that happens inside society and social practices.
Yeah.
We don't have a sort of a bedrock of a physical world of the way that we have to build up with. But there is a kind of this interesting tension, as you mentioned, between a necessarily shared world that is also necessarily individually encountered, and how do we sort of manage that? So the kinds of pluralism or multiplicity that you talk about in just your last point there is a sort of a key issue to pick up on.
Yeah.
I'll sort of just sort of quickly flag, and this is as much a this is comment rather than question more than anything else, but again, perhaps a seed for conversation or some aspect of dialogue, which is that I think it's precisely this issue that causes the sort of tensions between inactive researchers and ecological psychologists. So to a large extent, everything that you've said is entirely endorsed by Gibson and those who have followed after his work, and other ecological, Eleanor Gibson as well, and others. That, but the realism that, I guess there is a recognized tension in the kinds of realism that ecological psychologists want to endorse. Now, Baggs and Chimero in 20. I can't remember. It's either 2020 or 2021.
I think it's 2021.
They try to sort of tease this apart a little bit. And I guess, do you see a kind of a connection there? Are they talking about the same thing, or is that actually just a kind of a different question?
I think they are talking about the same thing, and I don't have it exactly perfectly in mind anymore, the paper, but I remember reading in the introduction that what they're saying is that really the whole realism-idealism debate doesn't really matter. And what we really have is that the enactive tradition has primarily focused on the organism side of things. And as much as I like to emphasize the world-involving nature of the interaction, I think it's very fair to say that by and large, the enactive tradition has focused on the organism side of things, and the ecological side has mostly focused on the environmental side, even though there are, of course, a lot of works on the visual system of the organism, and it's always relational. But in that sense, I think they really are complementary, and it's not really one of those things where we as enactivists, we can just start using the term affordance and talk about organism environment systems and then we're done. I think there are a lot of theoretical issues in sorting out how to connect these two bodies of research. And there's, I think, a lot of work to be done because this sort of objective structures in the light and these invariants, and it's difficult to parse exactly what that all means in enactive terminology. That doesn't mean, I think, that we shouldn't try to do it, and I think a lot of people have been doing that, because there just is, if there's no structure in the environment, then there's also nothing for us to become sensitive to in our action. But the structure is maybe relational, but there still has to be things going on. And simultaneously, for an ecological psychologist, there being that structure in the environment doesn't mean instantly that we have become sensitive to it. And there's still a historical development story to be told about how an organism becomes sensitive to those structures. So it's complementary, but nonetheless, I do think there's a lot of work to do on figuring out how that fits together.
So yeah, I mean, because as your point made, when we take a process ontology, and when we, particularly with the emphasis on historicity, which is kind of run through enactive thinking. Now, it has developed and has become more explicit again of late than it was in the earlier literature, but it's sort of there's a sort of a real core foundational aspect to it that emphasizes that individuality of encounter with the environment rather than the shared aspect of it, which I think is what the ecological psychologists and their interest in the lawful basis of perception tend to emphasize. Looking at that individuality then, just to bring in one of the questions from online here, in your on your ethics slide, you mentioned the individualism seems to be a shared block between realist and idealist positions.
Yeah.
And so are there suggestions or are there ways that you see to help unseat ourselves from that individualism, to look at or to be able to reorient ourselves from, as it's phrased here, from a me to a we role or perspective?
Yeah. I mean, one thing is how to do that theoretically. And then I think, really we need to work on participatory sense making, which is, I think, the sort of groundworks for the social perspective in enactivism. That's, social autonomy, the autonomy of the interaction, and which means that the interaction itself already has an inherent normativity. The interaction itself has the adaptivity where certain interactions, certain things that can happen can be good for the continuation of that interaction and can be bad for it, right? So if you're having a dialogue and the other person just, instead of engaging with you, just stares off into the distance, that is not immediately a break, but it instantly gets you like, wait, is this person still listening? Are we still talking? Or is this dialogue over? And I think that sort of perspective is important theoretically if we're analyzing things, to kind of overcome this rampant individualism. But then, of course, to also get that into just the basic way that you approach the world in just your daily life, right? This is exactly about trying to make the material difference. I think that's a lot of practice. I think it starts probably in joining some sort of organization where you can, with a collective, do these things, right? I think a lot of people have been joining protests and all of these sorts of things. Well, I don't know, climate change and all of these difficulties we're dealing with all at the same time. It's a fun time. But at that moment, you are part of that collective, right? And that's a very crucial thing. But once that protest is done, then you're all your individual again. And then all that you really did in that protest is yell very loud and be part of a mass, and afterwards you post it on your social media. And I think once you're organized with other people that are like-minded and that also really want to make a difference in this world, you can kind of consistently and structurally work on that change. And the more you do that, the more you start to feel this social autonomy that enactivism talks about. It becomes part of your being. If you more often move as a collective, it becomes, I think, more of a thing that you start enacting yourself as well as part of that collective. And so that's kind of one thing that we can do. I don't know if that's everything, if that's gonna make the difference, but we got to do what we can, I guess.
The sort of get into we habits, as it were.
Exactly.
I'm putting in mind, I mean, you mentioned protests there, and there are others, but I'm putting in mind of Fred Cummins' work on intersubjectivity and shared subjectivity in particular, where the role of synchronous speech So chanting together is something that people do when they're protesting, when they're praying, and on sports grounds, as well as in education. And but particularly, it's synchronized speech and synchronized action, synchronized movement are ways, sort of crucial ways in which people form these these collective subjectivities. Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see as we develop the science around that. Actually, we'll have a better understanding of what the dynamics are that produce these collective subjectivities. But it's, as you mentioned right in your first slide, when you talk about individuation and autonomous systems as individuating themselves, we are always, as a social individual, we can only arise within the collective that we're separating ourselves off from, so that there's always that kind of contrasting dynamic involved in the processes of us of being who we are. So just a sort of a quick comment here to feed into you, which is Mark James here mentioning the work of Jason Storm. So apparently has made very similar moves as yourself in the space of theory and looking at their broader implications. So that's a comment rather than a question there, but again, something to flag in if you haven't come across him. No. And Mark is wondering about the reflections, the implications of this account for our understanding of language. Is language then about reference or correspondence? Is it always ultimately limited? Does this have implications for basically sort of sidestepping the realism-idealism debate? Does it change the way we think about what it is language is doing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've given that a little bit of thought, but it's really a little bit. I think it's a bit of a question of its own, because language changes a lot of things, and we can have so at the very basis, of course, language is still going to be an aspect of that sort of social autonomy. It's in our interactions with the world that we develop these habits of interacting with one another, and once we codify those habits of interaction, we get something like language. As you find it in the dictionaries, as in the textbooks. But so my inclination, and this is maybe just because this is, perception is where I'm coming from, and this is the position I have there, is that maybe there we might need to do a similar move and focus primarily on the interactions in the world and not really about this word or this sentence in the abstract. If we take it out of the context, what does it do? What does it mean? And there might be value in doing that, but I think in some sense it abstracts language, which is really something you do, and takes away this kind of one characteristic of it, right? These words on a page. And you try to analyze that away from its context. And I think there might be that you might end up making a similar move as the representationalists are doing in perception. But I don't really know if that necessarily means there's no value in that, and maybe there's still a lot of value in talking about reference, and it could be interesting to see how reference potentially emerges out of these social interactions through things like dual attention schemes. Very interesting, and I just don't really have a clear position on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it sort of we get back to that process ontology again. I guess the whole point of once you make that shift, everything we sort of shift from verb to adverb almost. So from noun to verb and from verb to adverb, we kind of go from, well, it's not language, it's languaging, and then when we're languaging, it's well, what accent do you language with? Do you when you go about doing whatever it is, and again, so we can say that with language, but we can say it with perception and anything else. So it's less about perception, more about perceiving, and then what are the things that affect the way you perceive? How do you do your perceiving?
Yeah.
What are the habits you do it with? Okay, so we're sort of coming close to the end of time. I mean that in a very specific sense of this session rather than an apocalyptic sense. But
fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed we're not too close to the grander sense of that phrase. I will just take our last few moments to say thank you very much, Thomas, for sharing your work, and to wish you all the best with it. I think it's a nice meaty issue. Even if the first thing to do with this meat is to toss it aside and to move on to other things, it's good to see it get stuck in and to see other perspectives on it. And it's something that that special issue that you contributed to on ethics, I think, is one that's a particularly valuable resource, actually, because looking at the enactive approach's implications for ethics are kind of an exciting domain in which to get work done.
Yeah. And thank you very much for having me. And you're kind of right. It's very weird to put all this time to just say, we really shouldn't be concerning ourselves with this. It feels a little contradictory at times, but at the same time, I think I like to think it's valuable work.
Well, it's one of the principal things that we do in science and philosophy across the board, isn't it? It's someone's made that mistake. Let's learn from it and move on. But we need to make sure that we've learned from it first. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for a million. And okay, so that brings us to the end of our first ENSO seminar, but we've a great lineup of speakers coming up across the next few months. So hopefully we will see everyone again soon for the next ENSO seminar.
See ya.
Excellent. So we are now, I've lost